So today I'm going to be doing a very quick and simplistic run through and how I like to style proteins in Grease Pencil. So I'm going to create a reference first, which just entails bringing in any protein from the PDB. And moving over to geometry nodes, I'm going to change the styling over from the default style over to ribbon. And my initial plan for this protein was to section off the individual chains and give them like their own special color. But upon looking at how many chains there were in this, and you know, it's not clathrin, it's not an egregious amount. Going into Grease Pencil, I don't want to deal with this many different colors, so decided to just adjust the material and make it a bit easier to work with later on. You'll see what I mean. In addition to this, I'm setting up the scene by adding in an HDRI that I have from my Polyhaven asset pack and switching over the final render engine from Eevee to Cycles, making sure that that background is transparent and reducing the sampling amount so that my computer doesn't like die. Add in a camera, frame the protein however you think it's going to be situated in the scene. And here I'm going to adjust the material so that it switches over from the regular default material over to something a little bit more spicy, a little bit more visually interesting. So a material that I've been personally digging recently involves using the Fresnel shader and a glass shader. We'll end up with kind of a cartoony look, so you're going to want to add in a mix shader, and I do this in the wrong order, but bear with me. Add in a Fresnel node at the very top of the mix shader here to the factor. Lower that value to below 1, and you're actually going to want that outline material to be on the bottom and the glass material to be on the top shader node. So just continue to adjust that value until you get like this outline look. Like, to me, it's very reminiscent of just older styled cartoons. I kind of like the intersection between 2D and 3D aesthetics. Now we certainly could just leave the bottom material to be glass, the filler material, one might say, but I want this to be just a little bit more interesting. So I'm gonna add in a couple of additional shaders, like add shaders, not mix shaders. Adjust the color so that there is a red, green, and a blue glass material, and offset the index of refraction so that in the final product we get a little bit of a fun refraction effect. It just makes it look a bit prettier in my opinion. And I'm changing the roughness a bit so that it's not just a straight exact see-through glass. And just to spice this up a little bit more, I'm gonna add in a mix shader. And at the very bottom node, I'm going to add in a glossy BSDF and change the color from white to orange. I do want to interject and say that you don't have to replicate the exact material that I'm doing here. I just really wanted to practice working with reflective materials in Grease Pencil, so that's what I'm going for here. And as you probably can guess, what's happening on screen right now is just me futzing around and finding out what additional tweaks I want to make to this material. I'm not aiming to go for anything particularly realistic. Rather, I'm just trying to go for something that I think would translate pretty well over to a grease pencil interpretation. Also, save your work, because I'm a large proponent and believer of Murphy's Law, so you really don't want to test that. So upon further examination of the scene, I realized that the protein was a little more complex than I wanted it to be, to translate it over to grease pencil. So just gonna pick out something a little bit simpler here. And I'm basically just going to repeat the process that I detailed earlier and create the reference with the protein that I've just imported into the scene. Now that looks quite lovely. I'm pretty content with what I have here, so I'm going to render this image. There she is. Sparkling, beautiful, amazing. We could just leave it right there, but I'm gonna composite it just a bit. And by compositing, I mean just adding in a background color, so I'm not just working with a PNG. From there, I'm going to save my image as a reference for later. You know, you certainly could end the process right here, but you're not going to get a grease pencil work of art. So let's go on over and change the render engine from Cycles over to Eevee. From here, I'm going to just import my reference image that I've just saved. Scale it up a bit so that it is in the appropriate spot and size that I want it to be in. From here, I'm going to add in an empty grease pencil object. And so this next part that I'm going to show you is just my basic setup. I have a Wacom tablet that I have connected over to my computer. You certainly do not need to use one. I've actually drawn with the mouse before on grease pencil and it works pretty decently, but that is what I'm using. The benefit that you do get when you use a tablet is that you can potentially do different stroke thicknesses depending on the amount of pressure that you add. It's nice having that additional fine control if you're into that. So here I am changing the overlay opacity of the image so that I can see what I'm doing with the grease pencil a little bit better in comparison to the reference image that I'm basically tracing over. So adjust the radius, the strength, the material as you need, and just go at it. There, not so bad. Let's add a bit of movement here. So go over to the modifiers tab and add in a noise addition. I'm going to change that position over to a lower value and the randomness over to 2 steps, so we get a bit of a fast jiggle. You can change the thickness of these strokes. You can change the UV. I'm not entirely sure what that does though. You can change the noise scale, the noise offset, and the strength if you want to as well. This just gives the jiggle different effects depending on what attribute you want to change with the jiggle. To add an additional layer of movement and interest, I'm going to add in a build modifier, which does exactly what you think it would do. It builds the grease pencil object that you've just created. There are different settings that you can play around with. There's sequential, there's additive, and there's one more. Oh, the last one, it builds all of the strokes all at once. Now this is all fine and dandy, but it's a little plain, it's a little boring. I say we add a little bit of color. So add in another blank grease pencil object, and we're going to change the color to mimic that of the shades that we use to create our original cycles protein. So for me, that's going to be a nice bright orange. Now, I'm not sure if this is just my system, but the materials get kind of weird with the fill with the first time that you create the object, so I get around it by deleting all of the materials and the stroke slots and just creating a new material and adding in just the fill there. One thing that you will notice is that the way that the grease pencil fill material works is kind of strange. So instead of just drawing wherever your cursor lands, you kind of have to draw out the perimeter of the stroke of the area that you want to be filled up with this color. And it's kind of a strange process to get used to, but once you get the hang of it, it's not that bad. So Wacom tablet or not, you're probably going to make some mistakes, and that's what the sculpt mode is for. You can go in and nudge your grease pencil fill or stroke and make it so that it aligns a lot better. Here I kind of drew outside the lines, but I know that this mode exists, and you don't have to worry about making everything like exactly perfect, because you can go back and fix it later. Now you'll also notice that the color that I chose doesn't match the color that's showing up on the protein in the scene that we've created, and that's because we're in a pretty dark world right now. So add in a light, crank up that brightness a heck ton until your colors match the palette that you've created, and move that around until you get a basic setup that you're content with. Now we totally could, again, complete the tutorial right here if we wanted to. We've got a protein with the nice color, nice strokes, cool animation, all that, but I want this to have a little bit more dimension. I want this to kind of reflect the reflective material that we've created earlier. Play on words totally intended there. So just to recap what I just did, I added in another material, color, and lightened it up because I want to work on the first initial highlights of this protein. And we're just going to go over and make the approximate shapes that the kind of lighter portions of this protein has. Now, what I'm doing isn't an exact science. Rather, it's more of a general approximation of the way that light and shadows interact with each other on the object. So, just to give a very simple demonstration of what I'm trying to do here, and what you can as well, is to dissect our object into like 4 different parts if you're feeling fancy. You've got your base color, you've got your highlight, you've got your shadow, and then you've got mid-tones in between the shadows and the highlights that you can work with. So that's what this kind of mini sphere demonstration will show. So I think what the most fun part and what the most overwhelming part of Grease Pencil is the amount of control and choice that you have when it comes to coloring your object. See, Cycles, it does a lot of additional math and computation in order to give a sense of realism to the object, to give it its dimensionality, to show the viewer how light would interact with the object. Now in Grease Pencil, you have a lot more control over that. You have a lot more autonomy when it comes to deciding how much depth and how much texture your objects have. Now, cultivating the ability to decide how much depth, how light will interact with your object takes time. So even if it's as simple as working with a sphere in Eevee and looking at how a light will interact with this specific kind of material that we've created, it's valuable. And I'd suggest, pulling from references and learning what you can about depth, about texture, about color, about light and shadow in order to move forward with whatever you're creating, whether that be a realistic piece of art, whether that be just a fun cartoony little protein, or anything else that you create. That might have been a kind of strange little rant to go on, but it's just more of a reassurance that even though it looks like I'm working very quickly in Grease Pencil, in creating like seemingly arbitrary random highlights and shadows that end up giving the illusion of depth, it's more to say, hey, this takes time. This takes time to do, and I'm certainly still learning when it comes to giving the impression that there is 3-dimensionality to something that is very clearly cartoony and 2D like this. So basically just continue on, add in your midtones, your highlights, your shadows, your dark shadows, as many different shades as you'd like in order to give your scene, your protein, a bit more illusion of depth. And, as stated before, if you make any mistakes when it comes to coloring, when it comes to creating your strokes, you can always go back into the sculpt mode and just push and pull those different markings until you get something that um, fits your vision. Alright, back to the kind of more fun automated parts. So I really like how the stroke kind of jiggles here, and I do want to add a little bit of that to the fill material. But I also want to add in a fun little build modifier to our fill material as well. So, because we're starting off with the stroke material apparating at first, we're going to create the fill material to have an offset so that as soon as the strokes are completed, the fill material will follow afterwards. So within the build modifier, there's a fun little built-in tool where you can just change in the start frame, the start offset, and then adjust how many frames that will take up. You can select any mode of building your grease pencil, but for me, I appreciate how the additive effect looks overall, so I'm just going to go with that. Now again, we totally could end the tutorial right here if we wanted to. Like, this is a pretty self-explanatory animation. You got a protein, it builds itself, that's cool. But a feature of Grease Pencil that I also really, really, really enjoy is the fact that it's both it's a 2D like sub-program within Blender that exists in a 3D space. So you get this fun 2.5D effect, and I want to play with it on the very minimal scale here. So I'm gonna add in a little bit of camera movement so that it switches left to right and rotates around the central protein a little bit, and I'm going to add in just a couple of arbitrary cubes in the background. So you can see that there is a background cube and there's going to be a foreground cube, and it'll give a little bit more scene context to the protein that we've animated earlier, and will further demonstrate to our audience that yes, this is a 2D object that exists in a fundamentally 3D space. Oh, and did I mention you can turn mesh objects into grease pencil objects? I did show that on screen, I just didn't point it out at the moment that I did change it from mesh to grease pencil, but it's really cool. It basically outlines every single edge that you have on your geometry. So if you have something that's super high poly, it probably is not going to look very great. But if you have a low poly object like a sphere, a cube, icosphere, cylinder, anything that you would have learned about in kindergarten, it's probably not going to look too bad in grease pencil. So here I'm just changing the final output settings. I want to create a FFmpeg video, encode it as a MP4, and just because Eevee is so nice to work with, like everything is very rapid, very quick, just gonna render from there as soon as I make a couple of additional adjustments to the scene. Now this looks okay. It just looks fine. We can spruce it up a little bit in the compositor tab. Just add in a color balance node and adjust the shadows, midtones, and highlight values till you get something that you kind of like. I wanted to emphasize the orangeness of the scene, I suppose. You can add in a lens distortion, you can add in glare, although adding glare in the compositor section would be a bit redundant because you already have the bloom option in Eevee, which basically does the exact same thing. So I'm pretty content with what I have here. Gonna connect that final node into the output and render it from there. And voila! Here it is, a 2.5D scene with a protein where we made our own reference image. Isn't that great? I hope you really learned something, and I hope that maybe greased pencil could be a fun tool to integrate into whatever lessons or whatever science art you'd want to create. But anyways, that's me. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I hope you continue to have a wonderful day. And that's all I got. Bye bye.